Vic Rodriguez has stepped down as the little president or the executive secretary of the Marcos Jr. administration.
But Rodriguez will not leave the executive department just yet. Instead, he's been appointed as the presidential chief of staff. Marlene Alcaide with the big story.
While the Marcos administration has yet to reach 100 days in office, Attorney Vic Rodriguez has already filed his resignation as executive secretary. In a Facebook post, Rodriguez said he's giving up the post to be able to witness his family grow and evolve. But Rodriguez also clarified he will remain the country's presidential chief of staff. This was confirmed by Press Secretary Trixie Cruz-Angeles. In a statement, the Office of the Press Secretary said that President Marcos Jr. appointed Rodriguez as Presidential Chief of Staff, a new position created by Administrative Order No. 1. Angeles explained the newly created Office of the Presidential Chief of Staff will be under the direct supervision of the President. It will, quote, supervise and ensure the efficient and responsive day-to-day operations of the President to enable him to focus on strategic national concerns. For now, the Office of Executive Secretary remains vacant. The Palace says the Office of the President is now vetting potential candidates for the post. For News 5, Marlene Alcaide, we are One News.
Meanwhile, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. turned down a draft special order that sought to grant additional powers to the Presidential Chief of Staff. This was based on the recommendation of Chief Presidential Legal Counsel Juan Ponce Enrile. Here's what we know. The proposal had sought to grant the Presidential Chief of Staff the following additional authority: to sign and approve memoranda and other administrative issuances, implement instructions for the operations of departments, and implement policies and standards for the operations of the Office of the President and its attached agencies. But Juan Ponce Enrile believed that such powers would have caused unnecessary duplication and overlapping of functions that are inconsistent with the right-sizing plan of government. Enrile further said that traditionally, the Presidential Chief of Staff has no decision-making, signing, or reviewing power. The official also does not have the authority to supervise any government agency or act on behalf of the President. Here to share her insights about the recent changes in the executive department, we have Atty. Jimeno, professor at the San Beda Graduate School of Law and former Presidential Management Staff Undersecretary. She's joining us live via Zoom. Good evening, Professor, and welcome to The Big Story.
Good evening, Robbie, and good evening, Gretchen.
Ma'am, I mean, your reaction here, based on what you're reading, based on what you know on the new position being created for Vic Rodriguez, is there any danger here of any confusion on the part of the Executive Secretary, the new position of Chief of Staff, and for that matter, the Presidential Management Staff?
Yes, Robbie. I've read the opinion rendered by the current Presidential Chief Legal Counsel, Juan Ponce Enrile, and he does raise a good point. So the Administrative Code of 1987 organized the Office of the President Proper. So this President Proper office is includes what we call the private office, which takes care of the president's personal affairs, the executive office, and then the common staff functions, and then the presidential assistant functions. So we've seen historically that there are already positions that render services under these functions. So that would include the executive secretary position, which under Section 27 of the Administrative Code assists the president directly and also implements presidential directives, orders, and decisions. And for me, that's one of the key overlapping functions that was delegated in this special order that created the Office of the Presidential Chief of Staff.
Okay.
And when it comes to the common staff functions, we have the existing presidential management staff. And you look at the current functions as well that's being delegated under the Presidential Chief of Staff. it also overlaps with the presidential management staff. So again, when it comes to the danger of it's not just the duplication that's the problem here. It's also the potential conflict when you have someone that is delegated a certain power that already exists under the administrative code in the other offices. Then it becomes problematic because if they issue conflicting orders, then there could be confusion, but also the people in the president's office would also not know who to follow. So historically, there were instances where the office of the secretary has been abolished, and this was done during the time of Ferdinand Edrelin Marcos, the father of our current president. So I would say, like, if that is the intention, then the office of the executive secretary could be abolished, but then that has to be clear. It can't be that you have an office of the executive secretary that is vacant, that will be occupied by someone, and then have the presidential chief of staff that would have the same functions as some existing positions already under the office of the president.
So to be clear, it should be either or. Either the executive secretary position stays or the chief of staff position stays. And if I'm getting this right, it's not just a matter of prerogative on the part of the president, but really politically, bureaucratically, pragmatically, it is not also just about redundancy. There could, in fact, be potential risks in terms of confusion and in terms of conflict.
Yes, that's correct, Robbie. So the president has the prerogative to, of course, arrange his office, the executive branch, as he likes. But this has to be organized first before positions are created that conflict with the existing structure. So again, like you said, you're right. Like, if the intention is to have a new position called the presidential chief of staff, it has to be clear what functions that position would hold and what it would exercise, but it can't be functions that already exist with other offices. Otherwise, as you said, there can be confusion, duplication, and worse, of course, conflicting decisions among these positions.
Apart from the Office of the Executive Secretary and the Presidential Chief of Staff, there's also the Special Assistant to the President and the Presidential Management Staff. Lots of things to consider given the right-sizing direction of the government. Your thoughts on that, as well as, are there any names being floated, potential candidates for Executive Secretary at this point?
Well, the latter question, I can address that very quickly because I heard some names being floated over the weekend, but for me, those are, of course, just rumors, right? Until it comes directly from Malacanang, we really don't know who the candidates are unless they give their official statement on that. But like you said, Gretchen, the presidential management staff, for instance, under the administrative code, it is the primary office that exercises the staffing functions or provides the staffing functions to the office of the president or to the president, whereas the presidential assistant under the current structure in the administrative code provides what you call special assistance or advice as to specific matters. It's under the same structure where we have presidential advisors for certain things historically. Like, we've had a presidential advisor on anti-graft and corruption, or during post-Yolanda rehabilitation, they created the presidential assistant for rehabilitation and recovery. So these are, again, duplication. So I think, like, if there was a need to have this additional presidential chief of staff to provide assistance, it's really not clear why that is necessary when you have already a presidential management staff that will provide the staffing functions. And then you already have an executive secretary that will execute, implement the orders of the president, and would also have signing authority when it comes to the papers and documents that should go to the office of the president. And then, in fact, in the administrative code, there's also room for the cabinet secretary, which before was also occupied by someone, for instance, under both former President Benigno Aquino III and former President Duterte. So it's really unusual to suddenly resurrect this office of the president's chief of staff. And we saw also in the opinion of the current presidential legal counsel, Juan Ponce Enrile, that historically it's a position that didn't really last long because especially now under this administrative code, there's no necessity for it. So it is very unusual that this was suddenly created, and then to try to give functions to it that conflict with the other existing positions is not just unusual but also irrational.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Karen Jimeno.